Hi, I'm Joseph. I'm here with Isaac. Hi, Isaac.
Hi, Joseph. It's a pleasure.
We're doing a podcast, and this is our first podcast, so we're going to have a somewhat of an introductory approach to this, and we'll have some interesting things that we might not do again in the future. We'll also kind of test out certain things, and we may or may not keep those certain things. The name of the podcast, as you see from the heading, is...
The Iron Rod.
The Iron Rod. And now you may be asking to yourself, somewhat intelligently, what is the Iron Rod and what is the significance of that? And I thought instead of doing a general, interesting conversation or discussion regarding some philosophical, historical, or theological matter, which would be the purpose of the show in general, the purpose of the podcast, we would actually introduce it by introducing the Iron Rod. And now I'm going to play on YouTube, not the full 2 minutes. I would recommend very much to our listeners to go to YouTube and go to Google and search on Google the lyrics, so you could have the lyrics in particular, and go on YouTube and find the actual audio as well, and do those two things at the same time. But I'm now going to play the first few moments of the song from YouTube, which includes the Iron Rod, and then I will ask...
Just a moment. Here's Chester by William Billings.
Okay, so you heard that. You heard something about New England, and you heard hopefully something about the Iron Rod. And I'm going to be asking some questions, or maybe just one question. And the name of the show, the name of the podcast, Isaac, is Iron Rod. Mm-hmm. And tell us about Iron Rod, and tell us about the song and the significance of Iron Rod.
So the Iron Rod that he's mentioning is probably a reference to the Black Rod of Parliament, which is the gentleman bringing in and out the mace of Parliament, which is the symbol of the royal assent to the Assembly of Parliament. And the most significant event is, which is forever burned into the memory of all English-speaking people, is when the gentleman usher of the Iron Rod came tapping on the doors of Parliament in the year 1630, if I'm not mistaken, in the name of King Charles I, to arrest certain members of Parliament, and he got the doors of the House of Commons slammed in his face, which King Charles, when he heard about it, he came in with 100 men of arms. I highly recommend watching the movie Cromwell from the year 1970, by the way, the best movie ever made, that to see a very good reenactment of this. And also, if you want to have a look on YouTube, look at opening of Parliament, Iron Rod get the doors slammed in his face, which is something they're reenacting every time they reopen Parliament. So William Billings tells us that the term is the Black Rod, but he used the term Iron Rod. Why is that? Because the Black Rod, of course, is black because it's made, or originally was made, out of iron. And and what William Billings is trying to emphasize is that the tyrant, the kings who gives us, when they give assent to assemble Parliament, this is an act of tyranny, because of course under natural law and under the natural right of Englishmen, the royal assent should not be required to assemble the representatives of the people. It's by giving assent that they taking over the powers of Parliament, the natural powers of the people. And this is a very American idea. This is the point in which we could say here ends Englishness and here starts Americanness. And why does the tyrant need to shake his iron rod? Let tyrants shake their iron rod. Why is that? It's because this very important distinction between tyranny and monarchy that Aristotle makes is that a tyrant rules for his own benefit and a monarch rules for the benefit of the people. But at the 18th century, there is a more interesting distinction: is what is the emotion, or what is the mental quality or the moral quality that is the dominant in each regime. So the idea is, in a monarchy, honor is the most important one. The idea, honor or propriety. In a tyranny, fear is the most important one.
So in a tyranny, and by shaking the iron rod or the black rod, that's how you're kind of crystallizing that fear. That's a symbol
Exactly.
of that.
Note that he doesn't need to actually strike down anyone with the iron rod. Shaking it is enough.
And so a couple of things that I wanted to mention, and I'm not sure if you want to get into any of these matters, but something that just came to my mind was how much did Billings, and let's just give slight, I think many of our listeners would be able to know exactly what we're talking about. Just to give slight context, we're talking about the American Revolution. So prior to the American Revolution, as we all learn in third grade, or hopefully if we're not learning CRT, we know that we were all British colonies, and then we declare our independence at some point, and there is a pretty violent war and so on. So it's in that context, and this is, I'm not sure if this is written as wartime propaganda, perhaps you can enlighten us, or if this is written retroactively afterwards. But this is in the context that we are rebelling against the British and against the Crown, and we're being attacked by this league, including Cornwallis and Clinton. These are all names of British generals mentioned.
Howe and Burgoyne and Clinton too, with Preston and Cornwallis joins to get together plot our overthrow in one infernal league combined.
Yes. Now I'm sure this is something that I know the American Revolution is a particular interest of yours, and this is something we could talk about each of these characters for a long time. I think a lot of people have heard of Cornwallis because they associate him when he surrendered to Washington in Yorktown. So that's very famous. Preston is not so famous today, but I think he was captured in a raid by the Americans.
Absolutely. Hence, and generals yield to beardless boys. That's him.
Okay, so he was captured by younger or at least inexperienced people.
One of those young, promising officers under General Washington's command. Yes.
Yeah. So all right. So now just to establish what we're talking about. So we're talking about in the context of the American Revolution and our fight for independence. Obviously, we're going to be speaking about how we're obtaining freedom from the tyranny of King George III and so on.
Absolutely. Even though I highly recommend a book by Andrew Roberts, from a great scholar from across the water, who wrote a book that I'm reading right now called the Misunderstood Reign of King George III.
I heard a lecture of him recently, and I think it was with Victor Davis Hanson.
Oh yeah,
that's the one. Yeah,
both are wonderful scholars and individuals. Yes.
So we'll have to. You said King George III has, for a long time, I think, been getting better press, quote unquote. I remember reading that he established certain botanical gardens and other, patron of the arts and so on.
He was an intellectual.
Yeah. So it's not out of character for kind of enlightened despot, if you even want to use the term despot.
No, you can use the term despot. It originally meant a king or some sort of a king under the authority of the Byzantine emperor. So despot is a good word.
And this is very much an 18th century phenomenon, and this is maybe a subject for a future time. Catherine the Great, Franz Joseph, the Austrian guy who ended the death penalty in Austria, if I remember correctly.
Absolutely.
So different. And they took, even Frederick the Great saw himself in this vein, so to speak,
Yes.
Trying to correspond with Voltaire and other philosophers and mathematicians. So you have a lot of people.
George III actually hated Frederick the Great. He called him a pensioned king, which was.
We should remind ourselves, of course, that England and Prussia were on the same side.
Oh yes, but so England paid good cash for the privilege, and hence the animosity and between the King of England and the King of Prussia.
You talking about in general, or hiring the mercenaries for the American Revolution?
I'm talking about during the 7 Years' War, England financed the Prussian war effort.
Yes, because England, they have a tendency to do that.
Yes.
So this is also a very interesting conversation, speaking of the enlightened despot. But speaking of enlightened despots, even King Charles is not considered so much of a tyrant when compared to other tyrants. And I wonder, this is something that you could comment on or not, depending if you like.
Oh yes, absolutely.
What do you think about the question, does William Billings, who is an American, I believe, right?
Absolutely.
And a patriot, does he see the American Revolution as a continuation of the revolution that dethroned King Charles and the famous story with the Parliament and Oliver Cromwell and all that? Or is he just making a historical mention of it?
Well, he actually does, and the thing is, because he's a Bostonian, and Bostonians are very prickly people, even back then. No offense to anyone who is at Boston, but Boston always had a reputation of garnering people who buckle at authority outside of Boston. Let's say it like that. And especially since it's settled by Puritans, which were not very well disposed to the Stuarts who were in power at the time, and it's established, of course, before Charles I falls from power, and as a refuge to the Puritans who are ill disposed towards him, and then it declares its loyalty to the Commonwealth after he falls from power. Virginia, by the way, declares for the king in exile. That's why it's called the Old Dominion. And but after the restoration of Charles II, his son, Boston, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, very reluctantly returns to the British fold, but it still harbors a lot of the people who are now looking for greener pastures now that the son of the late beheaded Charles I is on the throne. Mm-hmm. So William Billings does see here a continuation of the original revolution of the English Civil War and what started it, and it's an interesting thing because George III, the king he's railing against, is not a Stuart, is a Hanover. And the Hanoverians, of course, came to power after the Stuarts not only lost another revolution, the Glorious Revolution, in which one of them, Mary, with her husband William of Orange, is brought over to England to depose James II, the rightful king of England, James Stuart, brother of Charles II Stuart, because he had the temerity to be a Catholic and to have a son that might inherit him as a Catholic, and not only that, but they also lost another what was essentially a revolution when Queen Anne Stuart, the sister of Mary, the sister of the childless Mary, died also childless, and the throne by all right should have gone to her nephew Bonnie Prince, which was who was called the Old Pretender, which was I believe he was Charles the third as the loyalist, as the Stuart loyalists called him, or the Prince across the water if they would happen to be of the Scottish persuasion. So Parliament simply decided that arbitrarily that succession can occur only in the Protestant line. Therefore, George III's grandfather, actually great-grandfather, George I, the Prince Elector of Hanover, becomes King of England. And that essentially is a bloodless revolution. So the Stuarts lost two successive revolutions after the restoration of Charles II. And George III sees himself as the embodiment of the success of the second revolution. So, but Billings and the Bostonians with him, they don't see it this way, because this was the type of revolution that was concocted by the London, by the Whig, how should I call it, old guard, by the parliamentarian in London. The folks of Boston are much more for hardliners. They just see it as like that. Parliament is Parliament. Parliament is the embodiment of the people of England, or in this case of Boston, and the rights as a Parliament are natural and native to the English person, and therefore the king must respect them. The king does not lend them power. The king derives power with them, or at least their power exists independently of the king's. Therefore, William Billings sees the iron rod as an act of subjugation, of unjust subjugation. The black rod as a symbol of unjust subjugation of the rights of the people to the king. And then again, this is an American idea. This is the thing that might have started with Cromwell's idea of a commonwealth without a king, but again, Cromwell came to this idea very hesitantly. Cromwell did not want a republic at the beginning. Cromwell wanted to negotiate some sort of agreement with King Charles. Unfortunately, that came to be, and immediately after his death, the restoration occurred. As you can see, the English were never comfortable with the idea of a republic, but the folks at Boston, they didn't know any other way of government. Those who were born at Boston. Owen William Billings, who was born in the mid-late 18th century, he never saw a king in action. All he saw was the royal governor, who nobody likes and was occasionally driven out of his house by a mob, and the colonial assembly.
Interesting. These days they would ask for hazard pay, I think, if you're being driven out of your house by a mob once in a while. Also, I believe at this time there was something called tarring and feathering, which is also a bit out of practice, right?
Yes, tarring and feathering it went out of fashion in America relatively late. Yes.
Well, I think up until the Civil War, maybe even later, there was still...
even later in the West, yes.
In the West, yes. I'm trying to remember. I think I remember reading in one of Bernard Cornwell's book a good description of tarring and feathering, if anyone wants to see
Very unpleasant, if not lethal.
Yes, less unpleasant for the crowd of people enjoying the spectacle, though.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's interesting you mentioned, so a lot of people, who traditionally understand American history from school or whatnot, have this idea that because at the end of the war, let's say 1781 with Yorktown, or 83 with the peace treaty, or even later once we established the Constitution, we made a full, clean breast of it, so to speak, with full, clean separation from Britain and from England. That means to say that that's how it started. But actually, I think you're making a distinction between maybe certain patriots in the United States having one attitude towards the king and another attitude towards the parliament.
Yes.
And they even had maybe a nuanced view in their mind that they were not rebelling against England. They just thought that the iron rod or the black rod was more tyrannical, and maybe they thought it should be a different man holding the rod, or it should be maybe a less metallic rod, less heavy.
Yes, absolutely. The thing about it is, at the beginning, everybody in America, almost everybody, is a royalist, pretty much a royalist. As a matter of fact, at the early stages of the revolution, in all the pamphlets and the broadside and what have you, people nicknamed the British troops, ministerial troops, because they say, oh, no, this king is good. We don't say any kind of anything against the king. We're just against the ministers who lead him astray. Of course, this is also a cynical ploy, because sedition, if you are living in a town that's still under British occupation, then you can argue in court, oh, no, Your Honor, no, this was not sedition. Sedition is to say anything bad about the king. You are not going to tell me that I can't say anything about Lord North, right?
And who is Lord North?
Lord North is the Prime Minister at the time, yes. And
I think, was he for the totality of the American Revolution, or for a large chunk of it?
For a fair chunk of it. He's a very likable individual, but not very capable, I'm afraid.
I do remember that after Yorktown, he basically said it was over, and King George III was pretty furious, and he sacked him as a result, or something like that.
I believe it was Shelburne on Townsend. We can sort out the details later. But
so that's an interesting idea that in other words, I think you're extending to a third degree. In other words, not only are you not against England, because England is represented by the Parliament, you're not even against the king in some cases. You're saying, well, this poor harmless king is being misled by ministers.
Oh, and of course we both know the idea or the tendency of people who are in circles which are very, very much in reverence and awe of a certain individual. When this individual does something wrong, we say, oh, it's not him, it's the people around him, leading him astray. He is not really aware of the situation. We all know what we are talking about.
Right. So that's definitely a very interesting a concept. Although in his case, it could have been the opposite. In some ways, King George III may have been more hardline than some of the people around him. For example, Lord North, who wanted to finish the war earlier, or certain merchants that this was bad for the economy.
Yeah, or a large chunk of the Parliament.
Right. So people like Edmund Burke spring to mind, who was active in this time.
Or the gentlemen who showed up to the House of Commons wearing blue and buffs to show the sympathy with the Continentals.
So that's quite amazing. So something like this could not happen in mainland Europe in this time period.
Oh no, you would lose your head. But remember, there's no.
This couldn't happen in France or.
But remember, there are no functioning free parliaments in anywhere else in Europe. It's quite a unique thing, and actually, people like Samuel Johnson are quite furious that those American colonists don't understand how lucky they are that they are the subjects of such a benevolent monarch, and who is the only one who have a free parliament under him.
Right. Yeah, it is kind of ironic that definitely, I think without exaggeration, England was the biggest power to be this liberal. I mean, there may have been some minor powers, Portugal or Holland, but some of these very small powers that were pretty liberal in press and so on, in movement. I know in the 21st century now during
Holland was officially Holland was the Netherlands were officially a republic and the word officially does a lot of work here, but I don't think you can, and yeah, they were fairly liberal. You can say that they and England were the only two sort of small L liberal powers at the time. I'm not sure what the situation was in Portugal. Venice is a republic, but it's far from liberal. But everywhere else,
they do have fun dance parties in Venice, right? Wasn't the carnival in hell?
Oh yeah, the carnival. But you still had but the Inquisition is still there. You still better the Jews are in ghettos. You better not say anything negative about the Holy Virgin or anything like that.
That's an interesting contradiction for sure.
Yes,
that you have in some of these northern Italian cities, which were very rich and very
decadent.
Very decadent.
But this confessional state ruled with an iron fist, and to a degree that's true in England to a degree, but not to such a big degree. I mean, David Hume, who wrote very shocking stuff at the time. If he was living in France, he would be branded with irons. I mean, I fear even to imagine what will happen were he living in Russia or in the Papal State.
Right. If I'm allowed to joke, I would say that he kind of deserved it for some of his inane ideas, but obviously doesn't.
This is not in your hotel.
But definitely David Hume's philosophies is something of great interest. One of the great philosophers of this era. So speaking of liberties and the effect it had in England. So England at this point is a little bit before the Regency, 30, 40 years, or 40, 50 years before the Regency, which the Regency was the high point in executions in England, if I recall correctly.
Yes.
So people being drawn and quartered, and isn't the book set, the famous book set in the Regency period, Tale of Two Cities, right?
Yes, the Tale of Two Cities.
So do you have any information about whether they were still punishing people for religious crimes, blasphemy and witchcraft and so on, or was it at this point they were just drawing quartering for treason?
No, witchcraft was out of fashion. It was actually the tenure of witchcraft trials in England itself was very short. It was a Reformation phenomenon. It continued in Scotland in the 18th century for a while, but Scotland was a backwater. What can you expect? I mean, come on.
That's what happens when you live in a country full of people wearing skirts and there's thistles everywhere, right?
Yeah, but you have to have your entertainment somehow. But and Scotland is getting seriously depopulated by all the people going to America, particularly to the American South. To a degree, in Ireland likewise, to a degree that Benjamin Franklin jokingly referred to Western Pennsylvania as the McOcracy.
Interesting. Because of the amount of immigration coming in there.
Yeah, from the Irish and the Scots-Irish and just plain Scots going all over the place. Yes.
So going back slightly, you were talking about, speaking of the Scottish who were part of the United Kingdom, they're not English. So, when you're a kid, you learn that, let's say they're in the Boston, not in the Boston Tea Party, but even then, the famous Paul Revere ride, during Battle of Lexington and Concord, people were saying the British are coming. Oh
no, they didn't say that.
Now why would they not say that? I think
because that would be highly confusing. They saw themselves as British. Nobody called himself an American yet.
Right.
Or at least not as a way of saying. It's more like it was like saying, imagine that Boston was in revolt against the United States. Would people say the Americans are coming, no, it'll be confusing because Bostonian would not be something that is counter to American.
Gotcha.
So people would say the troops are coming or the feds are coming or
So
etc.
they said something like that, like the regulars are coming.
The King's regulars are coming.
The King's regulars are coming.
And even that might be apocryphal. He just let people know that that soldiers probably said like soldiers are coming, etc.
Yes, and that's how the war began on the Lexington Concord, and but these names, Howe, Cornwallis, Clinton, Burgoyne, these are later, and these are during the major battles. And do you have any comments you want to make about any of them? Just in terms of the war, or should we table that for a different conversation?
We can table to a different conversation. Cornwallis, interestingly enough, made a very interesting service after the revolution. He was a very capable general. It's just you don't conduct such kind of the war was doomed from the start from the British side because the lack of support in Parliament, the fact that you have to ship with every British soldier, you have to ship his equipment and all his supplies, etc., etc., etc. And it's just England in the 18th century was not built to wage a war in America without local help, and they didn't have much local help. The population, as John Adams said it long before a single drop of blood was shed in Lexington. The revolution was in the hearts and the minds of the people.
Yeah, so as long as you could, but how was it? So you were saying this? It was Cornwallis, so that was a fait accompli when he surrendered 6-7 years later in '81.
Yeah, it was still a very hard work for Washington to do, and without the help of the French, we would probably have to conduct guerrilla warfare to achieve the same goals, and we would have ended up with in some sort of a Commonwealth way. But this is. But it was very clear that the English could not win this war outright.
I understand, and that's actually a very interesting opinion these days. I think that more and more people are coming to that. Unlike the thing you learn in fourth grade, going back to because I learned a lot of history in fourth grade, was that it was such an uphill struggle, and there was a lot of elements of uphill.
Oh, it was an uphill struggle,
but in that, if not for certain things, the war would have been completely lost.
Well, the war would not have been lost because but there's an important distinction. The Continental Army existed to fight a war the way civilized states do, and because if we have not won with the Continental Army, if we have won by simply pestering the English until they decide
and waiting them out,
waiting them out until they say okay, you can have home rule, but you still but George is still your king, etc., while they occupy all our cities, and first it will be much worse devastation to our countryside, to our cities. Second, we would not have been, if we wouldn't been fighting as an independent state, we wouldn't have been achieved the status of an independent state.
We'd be something like Canada today.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at the Canadian Revolution, it also was very much so. They didn't have something resembling an army. It was a matter of militias marching about, causing trouble and the English crown decided to give them home rule. And the Canadians, the British, and the Australians seems to be very happy to this day with the arrangement.
Yes. So this is all fascinating, and this is how we're tied in with the black rod. Now, in the poem, I think he mentions the black rod, which is representing the tyranny and so on. Now, why are we not naming the podcast the Black Rod? And I thought we would kind of. As we wrap up, and I have a few other things to talk about, let's talk about this, unless you want to continue on the Revolutionary War thing.
I thought, first of all, Billings refers to the iron rod. And the reason he refers to the iron rod rather than the black rod is because he wants to give it more of he wants to connect more with the biblical sense of things. And, of course, in the Bible, iron is rarely mentioned in a positive context. For example, the iron furnace Egypt is the iron furnace or the iron crucible. It depends on your translation. And and one should not raise iron tools to build the altar, and etc. 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 Iron is usually comes with a negative connotation, which actually is an interesting idea. Is interesting because it actually gives the light to the idea that the Israelites won against the Canaanites because they have iron tools. And by the way, the Israelites as a nomadic tribe, tribesman group would less likely to have iron weapons than the very skilled merchants and artisans of Canaan.
No, interesting. Well, I actually did not even know that this was a subject of controversy, that the Jews were successful in battle, not because we had God on our side, or because there were 600,000 adult male fighting, which seems like a lot, but rather because they had the advantage of iron tools. But that's an interesting idea. Maybe we'll have to get back to that some other time. Not very much connected to the British American Revolution. So that's why we got to the iron rod. Now, is this show going to be tyrannical? Or are we trying to say we're fighting against the tyranny? How does this apply to our podcast?
I would like to think that we are breaking the iron rod, and the reason we are breaking it is because a good tyrant does not rule by violence; he rules by fear. By the way, this is why I view most Russian rulers as how should I put it, amateurs in the art of tyranny, because most of them have to actually resort to violence. If you look at Catherine the Great, you mentioned her, she actually had to put down a major revolt. That's an actual failure. If you look at Stalin, you look at Peter the Great, all those greats, and Ivan the Terrible, and the reason is, of course, that Russia have a mixed inheritance of tyranny and an idea of rights of the people, because they have the mixed legacy of Muscovy and Novgorod. But that's another thing. But if you look at someone like Nicholas the First of Russia, he was a true artist in the art of tyranny, because he actually ruled by fear. He never had to put down a rebellion.
Interesting.
He barely had to execute anyone unless he really wanted to. Louis XIV, when he was a child, his mother Cardinal Mazarin, had to put down a revolt for him. But again, he was a child. But if you look at his adults, the way he constructed the Versailles system, he never again had to be afraid anymore, because everybody else was afraid. So, and etc. etc. So you can say that there's a difference between being a tyrant and being a thug. Most 20th century, what we call dictators, or most modern dictators, are not tyrants as much as they are thugs, because they actually have to land a blow with the iron rod. But classical tyrants, people like Pisistratus or Caesar or etc., their art lies in being in the fear, in just shaking the iron rod. So let's tyrant shake their iron rods, and slavey clang her galling chains. We fear them not, we trust in God, and most importantly, it's New England's God forever reign. It's the God that believe that all men have a right to be represented in their own government, and the prerogatives of the kings are incidental to the rights of the people, if not utterly dependent on them.
Huh. Oh, well, I'm very interested in that, and I'm glad you brought up the Russia connection. I also, you briefly touched on this, the Novgorod versus Muscovy division. If I recall correctly, Novgorod was like this very successful commercial city, maybe like a higher learning place even, and Muscovy was more like the blood and soil peasants fighting off the Mongolian hordemen.
Oh no, not fighting them off. No. Cooperating with them.
Yeah. Oh,
Novgorod was fighting them off.
Eventually.
Novgorod was fighting them off. That's why Muscovy won, because Muscovy fought with the Mongols against the Novgorodians.
Well, I was getting ahead of the story. Eventually, they did break off the Mongol yoke. But yes, you are correct that. So this is a combination of. So what are these two things? just to speak a moment, you kind of said there's kind of a synthesis or a combination. So this is what the commerce and intellect of Novigrad versus the cunning and wily and the brute force of Muscovy. Is that something like that?
Absolutely, because in the Russian inheritance before the Mongol invasion, if you have to look at the map of Europe, the entirety of Europe, from east to west, and you have to bet to place a wager, which one of those would turn out into democracy, outside of Italy. Okay, Italy doesn't count because Italy is weird. Outside of Italy, which...
sure, even the Italians wouldn't disagree with that, by the way.
Which, it's weird in terms... It's not really typical of Europe.
For sure.
Yes.
We've all read The Prince, or if we haven't read The Prince, read The Prince straight away.
We should read The Prince and we should read the discourses. Anyhow, so if you have to place a wager, let's say in the year 1200, in the turn of the 13th century, which region will develop democracy? You'd straight away say, oh, the Russians will do it, because the Russians pretty much already had, mostly lived in republics. The Grand Dukes or the princes, or what in Russian calls Kenyaz, was an elected office, usually from a certain dynasty, but that's besides the point.
Uh-huh.
So it's very similar to what later the stadtholder system, the Netherlanders would later develop, the Dutch, and the thing is, they were very successful. They were commercial hubs. They were learning and letters and theology after the Greek fashion was very much in the arts. Were thriving in Kiev and Rus, in Novgorod, in all sorts of other delightful places which are hard to pronounce, and Muscovy was one of those. And Muscovy was a specialty was trading with the steppe tribes. Of course, to a degree, it was all the Russians did, but the Muscovy was really successful in it, and they were not that important before the Mongol invasion. But the Mongol invasion essentially destroyed the old Russian system, and Muscovy it was the place to collaborate with it was the place that say, I for once welcome our new Mongol overlord.
Interesting.
So
this is like our dirty little secret. So like, I'm sure like these strong patriotic Russians, to the extent that they know about the Mongolian horrors and fighting them off, they would not want to love to admit the fact that they actually became great, and they actually became Russia. I mean, Russia is, like I said, a bunch of principalities, so they became the Russia by actually saying that
collaborating with the Mongols. Well, some of them would say, "Oh no, you don't understand. The Mongols actually taught us a very good lesson. When we were a democracy, we were a bunch of weak, selfish principalities who too busy with infighting to fight off the Mongols. Once we learned from the Mongols the importance of autocracy, we became important and we became great, and eventually we fought them off." So that's one way to look at things.
Interesting argument. But at any rate, definitely your greater point is that if you would have made that bet in the 1200s,
yes,
that the Russians would be the ones to foster, democracy or
constitutionalism,
or anything like that,
etc.
You would be totally wrong on the bet.
You're totally wrong on the bet. But the point is that the Russian soul really have itself divided, because the Novgorod idea did not die. It existed, and you can see there's some sort of hesitancy in Russian tyranny, because you can see, if you read through Russian literature, through memoirs of Russian noblemen and people involved in Russian government, there's almost some sort of an apologetic tone in them explaining the Russian system.
Interesting. I wonder. This is a subject for another time. When we're talking about here, are we talking 19th century? Are they kind of stymied by the French intellectuals or something like that? Because that just reminds you of War and Peace, about how all the Russian nobles were talking French.
The patriarch of the Romanov family refused to execute people who deserted from his army, because he said God did not made all men equally brave. So
true.
But so there is this kind of quality of almost apologetic tyranny, a tyrant that is very uncomfortable with his own tyranny, and that's why Russian tyrants always find excuses for the bad behavior.
If I could plug the name of our show one more time, so this is, heavy as the iron rod sometimes. Sometimes when you hold and you kind of gesture with the iron rod, it kind of feels uncomfortable in your hand. You're like, am I doing the right thing or not?
Absolutely, and it requires a steady, well-practiced hand.
Yes. And I think let's move on to a couple other things. Let me also say, now that we've introduced the show and we explained why it's called Iron Rod, what is going to be some of the focus and some of the topics we're going to discuss. And I thought I wrote this down, but I did not, so I'm going to have to go from memory. So I was thinking, I had a list in my head, some of the people we might discuss over time, that I know you and I have talked about most of these people. So let's first look at conquering generals. So some of the people that come to mind: Alexander the Great, Hannibal of Carthage, Julius Caesar, who a moment ago you also called a tyrant. I'm sure we'll have a fruitful conversation about that.
Oh, absolutely.
Then going back a little forward, we have Frederick the Great, who we also talked about. We have Napoleon.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not even sure George Washington. That's an interesting. George Washington is, I think, even better as a leader than as a general. But maybe we could even talk about him a bit. He famously, lost many battles, and he only won 6. Depends how you count
absolutely
the numbers. He definitely lost more battles, or at least did not win more battles than he did win. And some other great generals. So here's some. So if you want to add some great general, but these are the sorts of people we want to talk about.
You can talk about Cato, whose generalship is underrated, by the way. You can talk about.
Did not see that one coming, by the way. I should always see Cato coming.
You mentioned Caesar. I am allowed to mention Cato. So and then you have Scipio, of course. Scipio, which as Little Heart taught us, is greater than Napoleon, and of course he's
the first Scipio Africanus.
Scipio Africanus,
who defeated Hannibal.
Who defeated Hannibal, exactly.
Okay, so that's definitely an interesting conversation, because Hannibal is one of the other people
who famously showed him why in Total War II you don't just recruit an army as Carthage and land and naval bomb Rome. So.
Well, we try to bring this show, by the way, into the 21st century and into the modern culture of the younger people in today's generation who like military history and all sorts of intellectual matters, but also play the occasional video games. So I definitely think we will speak to the broader audience.
Yes. And
any other generals that spring to mind?
Well, there's one of the worst generals in history, which is one of our own. Tribe, which is King Josiah of Judah, who basically, how did the Bible put it? Actually, the Bible put it about one of his predecessors, but from the rival kingdom of Israel. But it's fair to say that he left Israel running over the hills like shepherdless sheep.
Yes, it's never a good thing to be, by the way.
Wonderful king, terrible general.
Yes. So, generally speaking, history is going to rate you for how good of a general you are, not what sort of personality you have, and if you're able to crack witty jokes. But, the sort of skills you in a modern boardroom that are more helpful are less. So that's a bad general. So I was hoping not to go into the bad general, because once we go into bad generals, then
absolutely. But we need to juxtapose the good with the bad. But it won't be a military show. It will be because it's about.
So let's move from generals to philosophers. So you mentioned before Aristotle and Plato. I'm not sure if you mentioned, but that's Plato. Of course, is always being mentioned because. What was a Whitehead who said that the history of philosophy is footnotes to
Plato.
Plato.
Yes.
And of course, you can't really talk about Plato without talking about Socrates.
Absolutely.
The man didn't write anything down that we know about.
And of course, Xenophon, the other great biographer of Socrates.
He's actually in 2 columns because he's
a general, and he's a good one.
He's a good general. Yes, and we were actually just talking about Xenophon yesterday. So here's and now moving on. And then some other philosophers of the Greek era, not to move away from the Greek era too fast. Pythagoras, who was a very interesting person.
Yes.
Then there is Zena, Some of you may remember the sort of riddles that you kind of really annoy you if you're studying him in college philosophy. Definitely the Greeks are very interesting. I think you skip straight away to the scholastic period, or at least the Christian theological period, for a moment.
Yeah, Thomas Aquinas, and of course Occam's from the of the famous razor.
Yeah, so everyone has heard of Occam's razor, and people don't know what that is. Like, what is a razor? So it's something you shave with in the morning. So that's Occam is definitely someone, and someone we should talk about. And much well less known than Thomas Aquinas today, who's very popular, especially among Christians, especially among Catholics, because it's in fact I think considered officially the philosophy of the Church today. It's considered very much.
He is considered the angelic doctor, especially because he had such a good interest, such a healthy interest in angels.
Yes, yeah. I think he devotes a lot of time spending, trying to prove the existence of angels and things like that. He doesn't just take it as given that it's in the Bible, though I think he does say that's enough.
And he's trying to actually rationalize what angels are, which is the most constructive. His angelology is actually the most constructive in the Christian sphere. After the Byzantine one kind of goes off the rails.
He was also considered by many to be a personally good man, not just many of the great people in general we're talking about were great but not good, and maybe we'll talk about the distinction.
Oh, yes.
Great and not. So one of the stories about you may know this story, but just for our listeners, that's one of the funny stories, and I don't always tell this to my family. They don't always appreciate the Catholic stories. That when he was young, his family did not want him to go and become a religious person, a cleric. And they wanted him to become something else, maybe a merchant or something. So they put him in a room with prostitutes.
Yes.
And he, of course, didn't want to fall victim to that temptation. So he grabbed, I think, a cross and he put it in the fireplace. And he had a burning cross in his hand, and he freaked her out, and she ran away from the room. And thus he was able to fight his temptation.
Yes.
So definitely an interesting person. I think he dictated to 4 people at the same time. Maybe that's how fast of a writer he was.
Yeah.
St. Augustine, you just mentioned before.
St. Augustine of Hippo.
Hippo. So this is fascinating because the Roman period is, of course, of great interest all the time, and he kind of intersects at the end.
Yes.
And that's why he writes the Kingdom of Heaven, and so to speak. He's
the City of God.
City of God, rather. City of God. So he could be accused of escaping from like real life to this sort of fantasy life. That's a big conversation. I hope to have some time.
Well, you call it fantasy. I call it the life of the spirit. But
yes, I mean to say a life not dictated by real life and actual barbarians overrunning the empire and slaughtering people. And, the actual work of.
You said the earthly Christian empire might have fallen, but the heavenly Christian empire can never fall.
Yes. So, what are some other Dark Age Catholic theologians or theologians in general that are interest to you, or should we skip straight to the modern era?
Well, there's Bede the Venerable. There's Anglo-Saxon England is underrated as an intellectual center. Everybody knows about, of course, the Carolingian Renaissance. Very little people know that Anglo-Saxon England was the place who actually produced a lot of intellectual effort.
Let's just pause for our audience. The Carolingian that's the with Charlemagne and the Frankish Empire. Right?
Yes, exactly.
So moving north to England, you're saying that they have a similar or a different type of Renaissance?
Well, it depends. They have a flowering before the Carolingian period.
Fascinating.
They were flowering almost at the end of the Anglo-Saxon period. In the middle, they have a lot of disturbances, obviously, because you have all those Nordic marauders going around, looting and pillaging.
That could be very unsettling for serious study.
Yes.
Also, you just brought up Charlemagne, which is I'm happy with, because I did not include him in my list of great generals. I just read in the Encyclopedia Britannica 1911, and for those who are curious, I very much believe that's the best encyclopedia, Encyclopedia Britannica 1911. I'm sorry, my co-host here is getting furious at me, but they say that Charlemagne was not a great general, but he was a great administrator.
Oh yeah, I would agree with that.
Ah, interesting.
Yes, Charlemagne was he distinguished himself in the Saxon campaign well into his reign, but that really pales compared to to what he did in the and of course in the Italian campaigns, when he conquered the kingdom of the Lombards, etc., etc. But that's really pales in comparison to his administrative skill, and for someone who learned to write to read at a very late age, that's an achievement, all right. But once again, his entire family was very talented. He comes from.
So I learned that he was. I read that he was only able to read and not to write. You remember?
Yes, it's because he was trained from a very young age to have a sword, and if you ever saw a Frankish sword, those things are heavy, and not to hold a pen. Nowadays, children learn to hold a pencil from a very young age. So whatever heavier functions you acquire later in life do not intervene with the way your muscles are structured, so it's not really as taxing to you, because that's actually one of the first things your hand is trained to do as a child. But imagine.
I have no idea. This is so fascinating. I hope everyone is listening very closely to what he just said.
But imagine if from age 3, all you learn to do with your hands is to hefting a sword or an axe or a different kind of weapon. And then at age 40, you decide, okay, it's time for me to pick up the pen, because because it's kind of embarrassing. So your hand is simply he doesn't know how to hold a pen properly.
Because we don't twist it. Because we don't have video, we can't see my fountain pen. Everyone should get a fountain pen, by the way.
Absolutely.
You can get a disposable one for very cheap on Amazon for around $2. So my co-host is showing why the use of the fountain pen.
So you can see that. So if you would have a video, you would be able to see that you hold the way we hold pens, and everyone could just get a pencil in their hand and see we are holding it in a very delicate motion. Now imagine that what you are trained to do from a very young age, when approaching a tool, is holding it in your fist and doing either a slashing movement or a stabbing movement.
Trying to beat the living daylights out of out of some marauder. Yes. So very interesting about.
Or your little brother. You know.
Right. Equal chance of those things happening. But we were talking about theologians, and I don't want to get too. A little later than this, we have the Golden Age in Spain and so on. So one of the great Jewish philosophers who gets some mention in Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, for example, and even Frederick Copleston, History of Philosophy, is Maimonides.
Of course,
and
he's connected to Aquinas, because Aquinas actually mentions as Rabbi Moses.
That was his name, Moses Maimonides. Yes, and he's considered by many the greatest, or at least one of the greatest Jewish philosophers of all time, or at least religious Jewish philosophers.
Yes.
Jewish philosophers like Spinoza were not necessarily religious.
But Jewish philosophy is just what we Jews call our theologians, because we are embarrassed by the idea by the word theology.
Okay, did not see that coming at all. That's an interesting idea that we are. So but Maimonides. Would you say he was a theologian, or he was a theologian and a philosopher?
I would say he was a theologian. He was a philosopher focused on theology. He was a theologian and a philosopher.
Right. He didn't, for example, focus that much on the philosophy of earth science, or what we just call science.
Or the just and the good. He's more of a theologian. Again, he says we need to understand the good, because the good is the will of God, because God is good, and the good is a concept that comes from God.
So maybe he just moves the good into theology. He just puts that in a different column.
Yeah.
And therefore he's able to kind of move everything into the metaphysics column.
Yes, exactly.
So a man who denies the existence of metaphysics is just a rival metaphysician, with a rival theory of his own. I'm quoting some British intellectual. The name escapes me at the moment. So he's just putting a lot of things in metaphysics. All right, so here are some, and then so we have some other, and there's some other Jewish and Muslim philosophers of this period who either influenced Aquinas, and we'll get to Neoplatonism, the column, and all that sort of thing, or at the very least lived in that sort of world where Aristotle all of a sudden becomes a monotheist, and other interesting and exciting novel things take place. But let's skip ahead. we covered some of the Dark Age theologians, Christian, Muslim,
And Jews.
and maybe even some Zoroastrians. Now that I think of it, moving ahead to the Germans. So immediately Kant and Hegel and Leibniz spring to mind. Which of those would you like to talk about?
I always liked Leibniz out of everyone because I don't trust philosophers who are bad people. And Hegel and Kant really rub me the wrong way when I read their biographies.
And how was Leibniz in terms of his personal life?
He was a very pleasant man. He advised a few royal houses. He was not an optimist. People, Voltaire is one of the most annoying critics of all because he criticized him for saying this world is the best of all possible world, and of course then Voltaire annoyingly writes Candide, which is a story about a person who basically lives a life of misery and ill luck and misfortune. And
I think he was trying to undermine the idea that Leibniz's idea this is the best of all possible worlds.
But the thing is, Leibniz did not say that this is a good world. It's just the best of all the possible world. So you can look at him as the greatest optimist among the pessimists, or the great pessimist among the optimists.
Gotcha.
And
so that's interesting. And then, not strictly a philosopher, is Isaac Newton, who's more famous for being a scientist. Although he wrote, even millions of words on philosophy.
Albeit he would resent the word scientist. He would say, "I'm a natural philosopher."
And the reason why I just thought of him is because Leibniz invented calculus, and Newton is also, generally speaking.
And of course, they have a spat over it that lasted years, over which they basically argue at each other from across the English Channel, or rather across the Northern Sea, who exactly invented calculus first.
Yes. Now, you may be thinking, well, I actually don't like the calculus, and I don't like whoever invented calculus, but then, the bridges wouldn't run on time, and other things that you need calculus for. So speaking of scientists, maybe some of the interesting people, because we're already in the 1600s, and we're moving to, Kepler and so on. So in the Greek era, if you were an intellectual, you were kind of all smushed together. So Pythagoras was this mathematician and this philosopher and cult leader and so on. And there wasn't I don't think there was a formal or at least an actual distinction necessarily between people who were abstract philosophers versus pragmatic scientists.
Absolutely not. And the reason is they were mushed together. Of course, some people like Archimedes, who was of course a mathematician. He found gainful employment as what we essentially called a military engineer, and
he did create very dazzling inventions. I would check out the mirrors if anyone hasn't heard of him or hasn't heard of that particular exploit.
And of course, we have Hero of Alexandria, another famous mathematician who came up with all sort of fun contraption, which, if not for which, according to a certain author, which I'll mention right away, by the name of Court McLean Jones. And I have his work right away, The Industrial Revolution, Lost in Antiquity, Found in the Renaissance.
He claims that he invented certain things.
Well, he definitely invented some sort of a steam engine, and he was not the first or the last to do so in the ancient world. The thing is, all these things, due to political pressures and economic conditions that were created largely by the Roman Empire, and it basically became redundant in the marketplace and ended up as toys and curios in Athens and other places to collect these things. So
this is similar to that if you were to find a diamond in a mine and you didn't appreciate its value, you'd give it to your child to play with,
exactly,
as opposed to redeem its riches.
Exactly. By the way, I highly recommend this work by McLean Jones, who is...
So this is not going to be a hard and fast rule. I do, generally speaking, not want to do more than one recommendation per thing, but we will try to do one official recommendation.
Absolutely.
And this may be the official one or maybe one of the unofficial ones, partially because I want to read some of the books that are being recommended. That's a slight inside joke, but I'm saying that half in jest, and I don't want to belabor myself. But we're moving on here. We spoke about, so But in the modern period, which I was briefly touching on, you now have people who are, even though they have other jobs, Kant is a geographer and so on, but you have Kepler and Copernicus that are astronomers, and you have other people who are, almost full-time metaphysicians or full-time philosophers. So in this point, we will talk maybe about some of the scientists, or maybe some of the philosophy of science, which is very interesting. And I think this is something that I find interesting, and maybe you'll want to talk as well. So we kind of vetoed Hegel and Kant, but don't worry, we will talk about them, and Kierkegaard. By the way, Bertrand Russell does not mention Kierkegaard at all in his magnum opus. We will talk about Kierkegaard.
It's because Bertrand Russell is very very logical, and you have no time for the anxiety of Kierkegaard, which I believe that's just come to show you why Kierkegaard was right and Bertrand Russell was wrong.
Yes. So we will talk a little about Bertrand Russell and his theory, but let's go slightly back. Before we mentioned Hume, and I kind of lambasted him, so we'll try to give him a fair shake. And some other, moving on to other types of philosopher, John Stuart Mill.
Of course. Oh, and Adam Smith, of course.
Yeah, and Adam Smith. We were talking yesterday about Adam Smith, so the philosophy of economics becomes important. Also, new types of intellectuals that are, every time you read a book that has the rise or the fall of the rise or some combination thereof, or a British TV show, you have to thank Edward Gibbons for that.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's definitely a book that I found immensely interesting, and it's in fact almost more interesting to talk about the book than the actual Roman Empire. But the Roman Empire, of course, is a fascinating subject. So we have Gibbons, any other people from this era period, so historians, philosophers, scientists, generally great smart men that we should consider talking about in the future.
Well, we have Samuel Johnson, one of the greatest wits that England ever produced.
I have one of his anti-feminist jokes on the tip of my tongue, but I'm not going to say it on the first podcast.
Absolutely, and since we mentioned feminism, there's Mary Wollstonecraft, which was the mother of feminism,
and she belongs in this period.
The tail end of the 18th century.
Beautiful. That's very interesting.
Yes, we mentioned private life. Well, she made a mess of her private life. Not entirely her fault, but she did argue about what we call feminist position, which nowadays we'll call the idea that women should be independent and should be considered to have the same rights as men, etc., etc., etc. A very interesting book. I found myself agreeing with her more than not.
Okay. I'm kind of flabbergasted. I did not know
she kind of
read that book.
She kind of lambasted military men, but maybe that's because one of the unfortunate incidents of her life was an acquaintance with a soldier. So let's leave it at that before we have.
Speaking of military men, we omitted one of the great military men, which is the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley.
Oh, absolutely.
Who was a great womanizer, and I can't wait. I know you may know the story, but this is the story I want to share later about how he got married to this lady who he was not attracted to, and then he became a great womanizer. Mm-hmm. And of course, in popular media till today, he's of course sometimes portrayed as very faithful to his wife, which is of course not true. So on the subject of, I think we covered some of the subjects that we'll talk about. This is not a comprehensive list, and we may add us a check. We were speaking about Duke of Wellington, which brings us to the Napoleonic era. And this has very much to do with the American Revolution, which is kind of the tactics and the types of weapons used and so on is right before the Napoleonic era. And the Brown Bess, European or American musket that the British are going to be using in the American Revolution, they'll be using 40 years later in the Napoleonic era.
Yes.
Almost no change. Some changes in tactics.
Logistics changed a lot. They definitely learned the lessons from the American Revolution.
Yeah, interesting. And certain things, there were less, cavalry charges in the United States.
Yes.
So less opportunities for an American soldier to form a square, though I'm not sure they would have known how to if they even tried.
You try to convince pre-Valley Forge American militiamen they should stand exactly where they're supposed to, and point the American soldiers, American militiamen, very opinionated lot, very heroic lot, very good very good at causing trouble to the British. But before Valley Forge, before Baron von Steuben, who was not an actual baron, comes around and beat some discipline into them in Valley Forge, they have some problem. They have some problems. And remember, those are volunteers from a militia, even in the terms of the Continental Army. So we don't speak about the kind of people that you pick off the street and you basically have nothing to lose and nowhere to go.
Yes, and that's...
We're talking about free men. When you fight a war with free men, there's a trade-off.
Yeah. So not so certain types of and I recall reading that. There's it takes around 100 seconds for a battalion, I think, to form a square, which is very hard to do while under pressure and musket artillery fire and while you're being charged. So I want to bring a quote. I'm not sure if we'll do this every time, but maybe we'll do this every time. I have a quote, and I'm going to try to pronounce this Frenchie's name correctly. La Tour Mabou, who was a French general wounded at Leipzig. And the quote is that he was shot by a cannonball that took off his foot, and his orderly was crying when they amputated his foot. And he said to him, "You imbecile, don't cry. You only have to polish one boot." So this is a quote for one of the great generals on. And Leipzig, if you don't know, is a very important battle during the Napoleonic era. This is a battle that Napoleon ultimately lost, and that sealed his fate, that he would lose the first time around his empire, although it would go on for a bit longer. And this is in 1813, just to give point of reference. Okay, so now that we got our quote out of the way, we're also going to do a movie recommendation. So the way I want to do this, perhaps, and we might mess around with this, is that I'll give the recommendation, or we could alternate. And if you know the movie, you'll talk about it. And if you don't, I'll have to make something up. So have you seen Zulu 1964?
Come again?
Have you seen that great movie, Zulu 1964? You have seen it.
Zulu Night?
Zulu 1964.
Zulu 1964, of course. With Michael Caine and the one and only Sean Connery.
All right, so
God rest his soul.
Is that a good movie recommendation?
Oh, absolutely good movie. By the way, they have another dual appearance in a movie called The Man Who Would Be King, based on the famous Rudyard Kipling story.
I did see that movie also. It was a kind of disappointing ending where they were chased out with the tail between their legs.
Yes, I mean that's actually a very, very interesting movie. By the way, Michael Caine met his wife on the set.
Interesting. So which movie would you actually want to recommend?
I recommend Zulu, because Zulu is much more uplifting. The Man Who Would Be King is very sad. And
so I'll give a short summary of Zulu, and then you'll give your additional comment, and we're about to wrap up. And Zulu 1964. So this is back. It was made a long time ago, even in apartheid South Africa, and this is set in 1879. It's the real story. There was still a kingdom, the Zulus. They had a very powerful kingdom. They had managed to consolidate power by organizing in a very regimented fashion, almost Prussian system, and by getting all the other tribes in the area under the Zulu king, under Shaka Zulu, to fight or to defend against or to fight off the British and the Dutch. So the British decided to do an invasion. The invasion goes terribly off. The British are massacred in this battle called the Zandawana. But the Zulus, not content with winning in that battle, a contingent of theirs goes to Rogue's Drift, which was kind of a supply depot where there were approximately 100 British soldiers as well as some natives fighting alongside the British soldiers. And the movie does not depict this, but what actually happened was that when they realized in such dire straits they were, 4,000 Zulus against 100 British, the native soldiers started running away. That's depicted in the movie. But their white NCOs, the British non-commissioned officers in charge of that little native group, also ran away with them.
Yes.
And they were shot at by the other regulars who were defending Rogue's Drift. And one of them was killed.
Yes.
And his name, the guy who was killed, his name is etched along with the other victims of peace. So you would have, if you would look at it without knowing this information, you would think that they all died in the battle. No, this guy was shot by his own side running away, because it was obviously very demoralizing when your own side runs away.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another demoralizing thing was that there were some, and this the movie depicts as well, there were some local colonial troops, that is, Boer, or from Natal actually, and they showed up on the cavalry, on their horses as cavalry, and the British asked them to stick around, and they're like, look, we're not sticking around, we're getting out of here. So it's always demoralizing when some of your best troops just leave, and now you have 100 British soldiers left to defend for approximately 24 hours this little station. The Zulus are armed with, spears, and some of them have old guns.
They have a full infirmary even before the battle begins.
They have a full infirmary. They have people that are, I think, kind of imprisoned, or more or less, they were on charge.
Yes.
That one of them does a real grand job, and this is actually true. And then people in the infirmary don't want to be evacuated when they have to, because it's being burned down and it's being attacked. It's quite a very scintillating movie. Most of the movie is, in fact, the action. I would highly recommend it. And what are some thoughts as we wrap up on this movie, if you recommend it as well?
As a side note, by the way, they have to flaunt a lot of apartheid regulations while they were making the movie because of all the Zulu stand-ins and actors. And actually, they did it quite cheerfully, and so if someone is opposed to the idea of watching a movie made in apartheid South Africa, consider it an act of rebellion. But if you have to.
Interesting. All right, I think you may be referring to the fact that they couldn't pay them with money; they had to pay them a head of cattle or something.
Oh no!
There's some sort of story about it. Some sort of legend.
There's an interesting history, legend, etc. What's the difference nowadays? Anyhow,
definitely a fascinating story. Definitely portrays the reality of the war. The movie is actually overly fair, I would say, to both sides.
Yes.
It doesn't portray either side as barbaric. Definitely very interesting, but it does show the sheer tenacity. I don't think many other nationalities other than the British could produce the sort of soldiers that would stick around and fend off vast hordes. I think, all right, this has been Joseph and Isaac. We're finishing our first episode of the Iron Rod podcast.
And you can find us on social media if you go look for The Rabbi Who Has No Knife or Knowing Western Civilization.
Thank you. In the future, we will update you on our other social media, and we will also try to put these things in the notes.
Absolutely.
If we're able to.
Joseph, it's a pleasure.
Pleasure was entirely mine, Isaac.